Hey everybody, thanks for joining me again. In case you don't know me, my name's Tyler Orr, the creator of Constructed Awareness. And I'm here today to talk about two concepts that are really important to constructed awareness, and that is nonviolence and non-duality. And this is really building off some things I talked about in the basic principles video. So if you haven't seen that, I recommend after you finish this video, you go check that out. It's on the YouTube page. It's also on the videos page at constructedawareness.com. So let's start off first with nonviolence. I always like to mention a guy named Ron Kurtz when I talk about nonviolence because that's who I heard it from. He's the guy that created a brilliant type of psychotherapy called Hakomi Method. He wrote a really great book called Body-Centered Psychotherapy. If you're looking for something to read next, it's a short read, really great, Body-Centered Psychotherapy. But in that book, he talked about nonviolence. And in the book, he talked about violence. He defined it as if you simply assume you know what's best for someone, then you're acting violently. And I thought that was a bit of an extreme definition when I first read it. It was a hard pill for me to swallow, but there was something about it that was intriguing enough where I began to explore it. And it turns out, through that exploration, it kind of changed my life. It changed my practice. It changed how I relate to people. So I owe him a lot for that. But as I began to look deeper into what he meant, what I got from it was if you make a decision about what's best for someone and you move to impose that idea, basically of how they should think or how they should feel or what they should do, then that's an oppressive act. It's violent. But the kicker is, he says, even if you assume what's best for them is they should feel better, it's still violent. Now think about all the times in your life when you've been upset and you've turned to someone for support, and instead they gave you descriptions about how you should think or feel or what you should do differently. In those situations, it probably didn't actually make you feel better. Instead, you just got more agitated. And I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me or how many times I've done that, like to my wife, for example. She's upset. I go into fix-it mode. She would always say this crazy thing, why don't you just listen to me? Why are you always trying to fix it? And I would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. How could that work? Well, I learned with time that it does work. The times that I've actually been able to slow down and just be with her and connect, her emotional activation would de-escalate very quickly. And so that's what I found true in my practice as well. I talk about in the basic principles video that with constructed awareness, we don't use willpower as a technique for overcoming emotional distress. That usually trying to make yourself feel better, you usually feel worse. And I find that's true also if you, the therapist, try to make the client feel better. Notice the language in there, make them feel better. There's a subtle violence that can be found in that. And so in the constructed awareness training, we're learning how to uncover the ways that we do act violently in sessions with clients, the ways that we're trying to impose our own will. And usually what I find is that if a therapist ever tries to make a client feel better, it's not because deep down, and I'd love for you to explore this for yourself, it's not because we really want the client to feel better. It's because in that moment we feel uncomfortable about how the client is behaving or what they're saying. Because you've never, as a therapist, you've never tried to make a client feel different when they're feeling good, right? So that shows that there's a definite preference. And when a client's feeling bad, that's when we seem to work the hardest. That's when we begin to push our agenda that they should feel good. And it's usually because in those moments we feel helpless. I always say that therapists try to help the most when they feel the most helpless, right? So it's kind of a silly play on words, but it's true. So we're looking for ways that that's showing up, the ways that we're subtly applying pressure, ways that we're subtly but therapeutically telling the client that they should get over how they feel. And I know that's a harsh way to say it, but that's my fear. That therapists, and a lot of times, are doing not much different than clients friends and families and loved ones have done their whole life, just telling them to get over it, to move on, but are we doing that, but just in really subtle, more loving, therapeutic sort of wrapping around that same message? And I'll tell you what, if telling a client how they should think or feel worked, their friends and families would have solved their problems already, and there wouldn't be any need for therapists in the world. So maybe it's not that simple. So in constructed awareness, we're learning a new way, a way that just supports, a way of just being, a way of being open to it all, both sides, right? The positive and the negative, and not clinging to one or the other. And that brings us to the concept of non-duality. Duality is two, right? And so in this instance, we have like a good, bad, negative, positive kind of thing. Because that shows up in session. So let's say, for example, a client says something like, I'm a terrible person. It's our natural instinct to want to meet that with, you're a good person. And when that happens, you get those two opposing forces that are sort of push against each other, and it creates resistance. It creates tension within the client system. And Ron Kurtz, he also says in that book, if you use violence, you get resistance. Resistance is always when two things press against each other. And so in constructed awareness, we're always looking for that duality. And we're looking for how to work with it in a way that creates more of a non-dual, more of a oneness sort of experience, a more open and inclusive experience. Two ways that we typically work with that in constructed awareness is, if there's two opposing forces, rather than trying to resist one or the other, we welcome both, and we explore what's it like for the client to connect with the full, because that is the wholeness of the experience in that moment, negative and positive, right? How can we help them to experience it all as one, right? I always say it's like trying to put something together with half of the instructions. It's really hard to do. So or like a treasure hunter looking for the treasure with half the map, right? That's sort of what we do whenever we reject one side over the other, especially if we try to reject the negative over the positive. Another way that we can explore that we work with that in constructed awareness is, instead of rejecting the positive or rejecting the negative, we welcome it, right? We accept it. And so, because we know, like deep down, if we have just one, there's no resistance anymore. But what we want to do is reject the negative. So if you reject the I'm a bad person and get rid of that, then it feels good. There's no resistance to that. But there's a part of the client system that doesn't want to let go of that because it believes that it's true in that moment. It may not be true that the client's a terrible person, but in that moment it's true that they believe it. It's true that they feel it. So instead of rejecting that, I would rather drop the positive and instead just really welcome what's that like in this moment to have this experience, and just be there for the client and support them. Because once that happens, there's no resistance, and that experience can actually move through because there's nothing pushing against it. So that's just a quick video on these two concepts of nonviolence and non-duality. If you want to learn more about it, I would invite you to attend Constructed Awareness training. There's more information on that on constructedawareness.com. I hope to see you soon. Until next time, take care.